Great. Well, thanks. And let me just ask if folks are not talking, could we just get everybody to mute, please? Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So excited to be here for this event. My name is Michael Ng. I'm a partner at Kobre Kim, but more importantly, I am very proud to be the chair of the board at the East Bay Community Law Center. Want to welcome you all to today's conversation on implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion practices at legal organizations. It's obviously a very important topic, and I expect that everyone, including those of us who are speaking today, will learn something. We're very happy that as part of this, we're able to provide an hour of CLE credit for the recognition and elimination of bias segment. And that's the participatory credits. We will be emailing your certificates to the address associated with your Zoom account. Likely that will be coming in sometime the next week. So be on the lookout for something from my firm, that's Kobre Kim, and that will have your CLE certificate in there. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our terrific EBCLC Executive Director, Zoë Polk. She is the organization's 4th executive director, and she began her tenure under heroic conditions 2 months before the COVID-19 pandemic began, and has been very ably and capably leading us through all of the challenges, both as an organization and with our clients in the communities that we serve since. And for that, we're very, very grateful for her, and looking forward to her leading this event today. She has been implementing practices for staff, for clients, for law students, and board members to lean deeper into our own equity. And so we're very glad to draw on that experiences and her many others over her terrific career. Following Zoe's presentation, we will have a panel discussion, and we're very grateful to the panelists that we have with us today. They are Luke Apfeld, who is an associate at Keker and Van Nest, Thomas Rivera, who is an associate with Hanson Bridgett, and Alycia Tulloch, who is an associate at Frankfurt Kurnit Klein Selz. And then we'll close out today's event by talking about the ways in which you can stay involved and connected with EBCLC. So thank you for being here. I'm looking forward to hearing all the terrific presentations and discussions we have ahead of us. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Zoe.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you to everyone who is joining us, our board members, our alum, and people who have been in the EBCLC's community for a very long time. We have so much rich content for you today. So I am going to get us started. Can everyone see? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my slides? Awesome. As Michael said, we are going to be focusing this presentation on implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion practices at legal organizations. First, I'm going to share some of the work that we've been doing at EBCLC. And then my colleagues and very proud EBCLC alum, Alycia, Tom, and Luke will discuss their work implementing D.E.I practices at their firms. And then we will have time for questions. So here's an overview of my presentation for today. I'm first going to tell you a little bit about EBCLC for maybe the few folks who don't know our organization. And then I'll talk about California's anti-discrimination laws. And then we'll dive deeper into some of the things that EBCLC has learned over the past 2 years. So just a little bit about me. I began my career as a federal civil rights litigator, focusing on police misconduct. From there, I joined the city of San Francisco and launched the city's first Office of Racial Equity. And then I have been in my role at the East Bay Community Law Center as executive director for the last 2 years. And we have been providing legal services, policy advocacy, and training law students. And so this is just a little bit about EBCLC. We are one of the largest providers of free legal services in the East Bay. We are a nationally recognized leader in community law, serve about 5,000 clients a year, and train about 150 students each year. Our mission is to promote justice and build a community that is more secure, productive, healthy, and hopeful and doing that through our three-pronged approach, which I've mentioned, which is legal services and policy advocacy that are responsive to the needs of low-income and communities of color, and law training that prepares future attorneys, including Alycia, Tom, and Luke, to be skilled and principled advocates who are committed to addressing the causes and conditions of racial and economic injustice and poverty. This is a little bit about us. I put some numbers to tell you a little bit more about us. To the left, over 85% of EBCLC's clients identify as BIPOC, 47% of our clients identify as women of color, and 68% of our staff identify as BIPOC. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about why that data is important and how it has been important in our journey to implement DE&I practices. And just to talk a little bit about our practices, we have 8 distinct practice areas in housing, immigration, consumer justice, community economic justice, clean slate, education defense and justice for youth, health and welfare, and social work. We pride ourselves in being a holistic legal service organization. We know that our clients are system intended. I know a lot of language people may see talks about system impacted, but we turn that on its head and think about how racism is entrenched in various systems and understand that because of the data and because of the way that the criminal justice system and all justice systems are working, that our clients are actually system intended. And so we know that if our clients are system intended, they are coming to us because if they're coming to us because they have an eviction court date, they or themselves, or there might be someone else in the home who have other systems that are interfering with their life, their liberty, and their economic security. So what we do is we screen them in and think about and ask if they have perhaps immigration issues, education defense, and education issues with some of the youth in the home, or may be in need of record expungement. And so at a holistic organization, we think about how we actively are treating the whole family and not thinking about our clients as people who have maybe one issue, given the way that the system works. Just to share a little bit about some of the key policy wins we've had over the last year. As I said earlier, as a three-pronged organization, we rely on direct legal services, and based on our conversations with our clients and the patterns that we identify with our clients, we work with policymakers and certainly other organizations to push legislation and to be broad sweeping change, sometimes even nationally. Some of our key wins over the last year was AB 1869, which eliminated about $16 billion of fines and fee debt for folks in California. We have established in Alameda County the longest and strongest eviction moratorium in the country. The eviction moratorium in Alameda County will not be lifted until the public health officials in our county decide that COVID-19 is no longer a crisis, which is unlike many of the jurisdictions around the country. And certainly it's important to note that EBCLC established the eviction moratorium 6 months before the federal eviction moratorium was established in September of 2020. And then AB 2463, which provides low-income homeowners this passed right before the pandemic hit, and this passed in February 2020. And essentially, this will make sure that low-income homeowners cannot have their homes foreclosed on because of unsecured debt, like a credit card debt or a medical debt. And that was, again, this is an issue that came to us where we had clients who had a couple $100s in debt, and they were facing foreclosures because of a misbill, a mispayment. And certainly that in a time of crisis like we are in now, that was untenable. So just to shift gears a little bit, this is California's anti-discrimination law. This law governs most of us in our workplaces. And I imagine, as most of you remember, about the constitutional law and protected classes. In California, it is illegal for an employer to discriminate on a whole range of protected classes, including color, gender identity, gender expression, genetic information. California is much more expansive in its protected classes than is much more expansive than the federal government. And then in San Francisco, actually, we even have even more protected classes in the city. So this can vary from jurisdiction. But this is what we're governed by. Essentially, all of us who are practicing in California and working in California are governed by. I would respectfully refer to this as the floor, right? This is, all of our employers are prohibited from discriminating in the workplace. But the conversation about creating a discrimination-free workplace today is vastly different than it was in 1959, right? And so certainly that behooves all of us to be thinking, folks who are invested in justice and committed to creating better outcomes for ourselves, for our families, and for the people that we serve. It certainly is incumbent upon us to be thinking much more expansively about how do we end discrimination than maybe folks contemplated in 1959. And at EBCLC, we decided that it was important to identify not just as a workplace that strived to be discrimination-free, but one that actively addresses bias. And so we had some work to do internally. And so when I thought about the journey we've been on over the last 2 years, I really tried to think about some main themes that came out of in terms of lessons learned. And this is the list that I came up with that I will try to distill for you over the next couple of slides with some examples. And certainly thinking through about how we build something that's long-term. So one, we want to set goals and desired impact. We want to collect external and internal data. We want to create internal structures, explore discretion, and establish evaluation and accountability measures. And again, I'm going to go through each of these and talk to you a little bit about our journey to these as best practices. So the first one, set goals and desired impact. Under each of these criteria, we also listed, I put a question, the question that we answered or we were looking to answer with this goal. So when we say we want to be, an organization that is a leader in diversity, equity, inclusion principles, what is our goal for that? What are the outcomes that we want to get to with that? And so, ultimately, as our goals as an organization are very much what I said to you at the start of my presentation. We provide direct services, we advocate for policy changes, we train law students, and then certainly as a nonprofit organization, we must raise revenue, right? And the key thing to think about is that our business model, diversity, equity, inclusion is integral to every piece of our business model, right? So we need to attract and retain diverse and competitive talent in order to accomplish our goals. We need to maintain and continue to build trust with our clients. And we need to identify and dismantle internal disparate policies, right? All of these things play together in terms of us being the workplace that we espouse that we are, us being the organization that has the values that we lead with. All of these came into play. And the second piece of that, or the piece that certainly accompanies that, is what does our data tell us? How are we thinking about our internal and external data? Because it's one thing to say these are our values. It's another thing to think about how are our values showing up and who we hire, who leads our organization, who are the folks who fund our organization, who are the folks who are coming to us. So these are just a few of the statistics that we learned over this after our first year about who are the folks who that we serve and who are the folks who are at our organization. I can't underscore enough that implementing a staff demographic study is important, is a key thing that organizations should do. It's important to be thinking about who is at your organization, and as the question says, where are your data gaps? Where are, how does who's in your organization reflect, and when you look at who's in your organization, when you look at who's in your leadership organization, how are your diversity, equity, inclusion values manifested throughout the organization? In terms of who you're accepting money from, I know many of us on this call are folks who are actually in the for-profit business, and thinking about how diversity is showing up then. Who is missing from, if you think about the demographic data of the folks who are your clients, who is missing from that? And so those are all questions that you think about when you're thinking about when we start with saying we want to be a workplace that is known for being anti-discrimination, and we want to be potentially a leader in our profession for diversity and equity and inclusion values. These are things we need to get comfortable with. Data it should be an easy one for many organizations. And for us, we had the data. We have a data and evaluations manager. We have a database that could give us this information really quickly. It was also just making sure that everyone in the organization understood this data, and everyone was invited to be part of the conversation what this data should mean to us as well. Next, we want to think about internal structures. And one of the wonderful things about Alycia, Tom, and Luke is that they are all part of internal structures at their organizations, and they're going to talk a little bit more about what that work looks like at their firms. What your organization is doing to create an ongoing, sustainable structure that if someone leaves your organization, the structure doesn't come apart. How is diversity and inclusion institutionalized in your organization? That is very key. For a lot of us, that does look like having a regular committee of people who meet and who discuss what are the priorities and goals for the organization for that year. At EBCLC, we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee that has worked together with consultant, work together to create a roadmap and say, these are our goals as an organization. These are areas that we need improvement on. And so one of the things that we learned is that this committee, which is made up primarily of staff, needs to have an investment from executive management in order to be successful. And that investment can certainly look like time. That investment can certainly look like how much time, time that the committee has to meet. And can also look like the time that they get to, that the executive management is spending listening and implementing the goals that they identify. And I'd also just say recruitment and hiring were key priorities for our DE&I committee, but their success also depended on us on instituting a culture of the organization. So it's really, I want to be very clear that DE&I practices, hiring is a big part of that, and retaining folks who from diverse backgrounds is important, but also thinking about your organization and how your organization is contributing to whether people want to stay at your people from diverse backgrounds want to stay at your organization is also integral to that. One of the things I'll share is that when we hired our deputy directors at EBCLC in 2020, working with the Equity and Inclusion Committee to accomplish the goals on the roadmap was in their job description. And I share that because it's really important to think about when you're, the deputy directors are essentially the second tier, after me, the second tier of leadership of the organization. It's really important to think about that being built into their job description as the leadership of the organization. And I think that there's an interesting conversations that are had about how chief diversity officers are empowered and how that power should be actually shared throughout the executive team. Explore discretion. Thinking about how is power and discretion understood and exercised at your organization. Helping employees identify their areas of influence and can strengthen morale and implementation of DE&I goals. If everyone in the organization is saying, well, I think, so if I'm saying as an executive director, well, I think all the DE&I work is supposed to be done by our committee, and they're saying, well, no, this DE&I work is supposed to be pushed by the executive director, and we're not thinking about where each of us have discretion, then we're not going to make progress on our goals. So it's really important to be thinking about where discretion is and thinking about who should be leading and bottom lining work moving forward. Regular training on how biases show up in workplace decision making is also important resources for staff. And modeling transparent communication from executive leadership about organization-wide decisions reinforces that training. So it's one thing to do a one and done training. It's another thing to say, okay, this is how I'm modeling how we institute that. As a lead decision maker at our organization, and as someone with a racial justice background, it'd be very easy for me to say, I made this decision and you should just trust that this has racial justice, that I got to this decision because of my background and because of what I tell you. It's a very different approach to say, this is where I'm going and this is my rationale, and open yourself up to actually get critical feedback, even as a person who ultimately bottom lines a decision. And that's the journey that we are on at EBCLC. And it is certainly a bumpy one. It's, there are times where I have to be humbled by, feedback that I get on decisions that I make. But if we want to model a workplace and a practice that actually invites people in, that is necessary. And then last one I would say is establish evaluation and accountability measures. What does success look like? Like if you were to say we are exactly where we want to be on our DE&I goals, you should think about that in the beginning. What would that look like in a year or 5 years from now? And what benchmarks can you set to allow yourself for course correction? So if you look up in a year and you are not at where you thought you would be, then what practices can you put in place, or what can you come to an agreement about how you're going to course correct and make sure you do get back on track? So surveys are always important ways to communicate information to your staff, but also to collect information. People give you a lot of information when you ask them questions about different practices of the organization, whether that's reopening your organization in terms referring to COVID, whether that's thinking through a whole range of issues. Surveys are key. When you think about replication of practices and policies and indicator of impact, at EBCLC, we rely on hiring committees to do a fair amount of our hiring. So the ability for all those hiring committees to incorporate the values and the practices we have as a DE&I organization each time we do a hire is really important. If it looks different every time we hire somebody, then we're not doing our best work. And so looking at the ability to replicate our processes is really key. And then also being in hearing and getting the feedback from clients, collaborators, employees. We got a big lesson learned on our social media, actually. And it's, I imagine many of your organizations have social media. It's the way you communicate with clients. It's the way you communicate with potential employees. It's the way you communicate with a whole range of external stakeholders. And we got a comment once that was, that basically made us think about whether the post we had was as inclusive as it should have been. And it was important for us to model how you respond to that and track that and think about how we could work that into as we think about social media going forward. And I think any time that you get feedback, particularly for communications that are understood by external, internal, even in an organization level, it's important to model how you're going to receive that feedback and what you're going to do with that feedback. And especially if you want to create a culture in which people are willing to and wanting to come to you when they feel like there is bias taking place in the workplace. The big summation is creating a discrimination-free workplace requires ongoing employer and employee engagement and commitment. It's hard work. And I'm really excited to, this is what as I said, this is what we are doing at EBCLC. What I'm interested in, I imagine many of you are interested in as well, is thinking through what this looks like also in other legal organizations like law firms where Alycia, Tom, and Luke are all from. So I want to pivot to our panel, and again wanted to say that we will be taking questions, and those questions will be at the end of the panel. If you have questions in the interim, you're free to drop them in the chat, and we will keep track of those as well. But at this time, I'm going to invite Luke and Alycia and Tom into the conversation and talk a little bit about the work that they are from at the very different workplaces they are. So the first question I want to ask each of you is for us to get to know you, and for us, of course, to do an EBCLC shout out. Can you each share which clinic that you were at EBCLC? As folks who are new to us, I shared the 8 clinics. So for students who work with us, go through one of those clinics, as Tom and Alycia and Luke did. Which clinic were you at, and how has that impacted your journey into your current role? And let's start with Alycia.
Yes, of course. So hi, everyone. My name is Alycia Tulloch, as Zoe mentioned. During my time at Berkeley, I was in the Education, Defense, and Justice for Youth Clinic, also known as EDGI. And it was honestly like one of the highlights of my time in school. Like my family is Black Jamaican American and I'm first generation American. So growing up, we faced a lot of issues at the intersection of just criminal law and immigration. And because of this, I was always very acutely aware of the school to prison pipeline. And I wanted to join a clinic where I could do a lot of work towards dismantling that system, right? So my work in EDGI, I would say, impacted my journey to my current role in that my reasoning for maintaining a strong pro bono practice is the same. I joined EDGI because there's so many issues facing the world, specifically minorities of all types are facing so many problems, and I wanted to do work that could make a difference. And the same holds true in my current role, right? As an associate at Frankfurt Kurnit, I'm able to develop my practice as a litigator while maintaining my ties to the community and continuing to seek pro bono and public interest oriented work.
Thank you, Alycia. How about Tom?
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you all here. Again, my name is Tom Rivera, and I did the housing clinic when I was at Berkeley Law. I picked that one just because it kind of spoke to me. In my mind, housing is just so fundamental to kind of everything, right? It's fundamental to economic justice, fundamental to racial justice, socioeconomic. I mean, at all levels, like where you go to sleep at night is literally the one thing that most people can rely on, and something that not everyone can. It bothered me that wasn't true for everybody. So it's a very litigation-heavy clinic. I wanted to kind of get in there. I was pretty pent up from first year of law school, just reading cases and not being able to fight over the fights I wanted to have. So they threw me right into eviction defense and advocating for clients who were facing eviction cases. A lot of that ones weren't justified. A lot of ones had a lot of pretext. So that really helped me kind of just get perspective again as to why I wanted to do this whole lawyer thing in the first place. And I think I carry a lot of lessons forward from that. Just in how I interact with people, how I look at cases. I mean, when you are the person that your client looks to because they absolutely need your help, it does carry a lot of weight. It really makes you respect the power you have as an attorney or as an advocate. So now my role at Hanson Bridgett, there's a lot of things that I try and do to kind of bring this back. I mean, anything from just having that perspective in cases to understand that, yes, I'm defending a case, but this person feels wrong. Like there's something we have to think about there and explore. And how we talk about our defenses, how we talk, how we write our briefs, the language we use, all those kind of are swirling in my head. And it's also inspired me to be really involved, like Alycia, in our pro bono work. So I was actually able to start a new kind of partnership with tenant counseling and consulting services between Hanson Bridgett and Centro Legal, which is kind of a sister organization to EBCCLC. It also does eviction defense and housing work. So it comes up in a lot of intangible ways, and I'm trying to, find new ways to kind of make it more structural and more, tangible and action step related, but that's in a nutshell.
And I'll round this out. I'm Luke. Good to see everyone, and thank you for joining. And I think one of the wonderful things about Berkeley is as soon as you step on campus, you're going to be surrounded by like-minded people with a variety of experiences. That's why I chose to come to Berkeley. I wanted to be in that environment. But I also knew that Berkeley would give me an opportunity to not just study Black letter law and sit in a classroom. I was going to get an opportunity right off the bat to kind of put my money where my mouth was, so to speak, and actually become an advocate and learn how to advocate for some of the most vulnerable people. Something I care very much about is young Black men and how they're portrayed in America, the opportunities that they're given, how they're treated. And I was also a member of EDGI, like Alycia, and I got the opportunity to work with a lot of young Black boys who were caught in the juvenile justice system or who were facing expulsion for a variety of reasons. And as Zoe talked about, system intended individuals, right? The system is working how it was designed. What are these ways that we can learn to hone skills to advocate for these folks that otherwise can't advocate for themselves? I knew I wanted to be a trial attorney. And as a member of EDGI, I was in juvenile court talking, advocating in front of judges for my client, working with my client. And that has stuck with me. And I think that's the best part about having gone to Berkeley, was being a member of EBCLC and being able to envision what life as a civil rights advocate, a civil rights attorney actually looked like as early as a 2L.
Thank you for that. I appreciate all of you just sharing that reflection. Especially, I imagine we have some students, EBCL students on right now. So just to be able to see you and hear you talk about your experience in a way that resonates with them is probably really uplifting. So thank you. So each of you, we reached out to each of you because we know about your current work. And in addition to being attorneys at your firm, you're also involved in the diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives at your firm and the internal structures that I had mentioned before. Can you share a little bit more about some of the work that you're doing internally at your firm to address some of the issues we talked before about making an anti-discrimination workplace, to also espouse some of the values that you talked about that you got at EBCLC? And this time we'll go Luke, Alycia, and then Tom.
Sure. I think that, like I mentioned previously, the biggest thing I learned from EBCLC was how to be an advocate and how to take a system as is and figure out how I can change that system or manipulate that system in a way that will benefit, if not my client, others generally. And I think that's a similar mindset you have to have when it comes to DEI initiatives, and not just DEI initiatives, any change that you wish to see at any sort of institution. Change does not come easy, especially when we're talking about law firms, right? These are structures that have been around for a very long time. Hierarchies are fairly rigid, and change is hard to come by. So you need to be an advocate, and you need to be steadfast. You need to be ready to hear no. You need to be ready to put the work in on top of the work you're doing. And one of the things I love about being at Keker is that, unlike some of the other firms, we're still relatively young and relatively small. So that means we're even more malleable, right? There's still a lot of room where we can make changes that are going to be even louder down the road and spark even more change down the road, because the structure isn't as set in stone as perhaps a bigger law firm. So some of the things we've been doing is really enhancing and embellishing our DEI committee, and then parlaying that into affinity group committees as our understanding in the legal institution of what affinity groups are expands, right? Diversity is a broad umbrella, and there are so many things that fall under that umbrella. So making sure that everybody has a space where their voices are heard, creating connection between DEI committee, the other affinity committees, and the management committee, as Zoe was talking about, so that we can actually have proposals that become into actionable change. So those are some of the things that we've been doing and continually do. But at the end of the day, it's all about keeping the pressure on, honing those advocacy skills that I learned at EBCLC in order to kind of make a place that you think you want to be at and others coming after you would want to be at as well.
So with Frankfurt Kurnit, one of the reasons I was actually really excited to start at this firm is because we have a few different groups that focus on DEI work. So we have the diversity committee that examines all areas of the firm for ways we can improve. So that includes like policies, practices, procedures, all with an eye towards structuring and leading like pretty measurable diversity initiatives. So anything that has to do with changing or creating diversity policies at the firm as a whole goes to the diversity committee. And then for me personally, I'm actually part of two different groups. I'm a part of the Racial Justice Task Force, and I'm a member of the firm's Pro Bono Committee. So the Racial Justice Task Force, RJT, is a group comprised of staff and attorneys. So it's not just attorneys at the firm who have a passion for racial justice work and who want to program specifically around racial justice issues. And on the other hand, the Pro Bono Committee is made up solely of attorneys who focus on just a wide array of pro bono initiatives at the firm level. So in RJT right now, we have working groups that focus on different activities inside and outside of the firm. And for example, right now, our Pipeline Partnerships Working Group is focusing on spearheading programs for Frankfurt Kurnit volunteers to work with high school and college students in underserved areas. So bringing back my work with EDGI. And while like right now, we're still focusing on assessing the actual need, but it can still be something like hosting mock interviews to build job searching skills, or it can be something more legal in nature to tie in my litigation. And our community organizing working group is currently exploring ways for the firm to, you know, work with community orgs that are already formed and just provide any assistance they would need. So that could look like sponsoring, and we're currently considering working a voter registration event or two during the next election cycle. So just being active in the community to that degree. All that to say, at the firm, we have a lot of initiatives currently taking place or in the works. And I believe that really showcases our commitment to DEI. And I think I'm also just really able to tie in, you know, my background in pro bono work, my background in public interest work, all the work I did at EBCLC and EDGI, and bring that into the firm setting.
Yeah, sort of similar. I picked Hanson Bridgett specifically because there was there's actually a lot more to its commitment to diversity and pro bono than I saw other places I was looking at when I was going through law school. There, it's a place where there actually is a lot of structure already that's been developing over, you know, those 5 or so decades it's been around. So a lot of the thing was, you know, that trail was blazed for me in a lot of ways. There wasn't as much of a battle to, you know, see the structure that's there, and now it's there's a lot of effort to kind of, you know, find like what's the next step. I think Zoe talked about it earlier about identifying what's the goal. You know, it's kind of, you're constantly evaluating where things are at. So for me personally, you know, I'm still in my first year, wrapping up my first year, so that I'm still trying to get my footing in the firm generally. But I've been lucky enough to be involved in some of our recruiting efforts and, like I said, our pro bono work. So, you know, a lot of it just kind of has to do the same thing. You know, you ask the question, okay, there's this pro bono project you want to do. Why haven't we done it yet? Oh, there's this concern. Is that really a concern? You basically keep asking, and eventually someone says, oh, I guess not. And then suddenly there's a new pro bono project. You know, it's having those conversations that I think are a big part of it. So the firm itself has, we call it internally the Diversity and Inclusion Network. It's kind of an umbrella organization that, you know, does a lot of things, anywhere from like career fairs to resume workshops. We host an annual interview workshop with first year law students, you know, from diverse backgrounds, trying to get them, you know, used to interviewing for legal jobs and help them advocate for themselves and put themselves in the best light forward. There's also a lot of financial investment. There's a lot of charitable giving that goes around, and that committee, as well as a new position that was created, who's our director of pro bono and community outreach. He is also kind of in charge of looking for new opportunities and also looking for events to sponsor, looking to host more workshops and looking for different ways to get involved with that. There's also a big effort in the firm to kind of just look at just a ground up review of how we do our hiring practices, which is why I'm kind of looking to get involved more with our recruiting efforts, because I think that's how you create a sustainable model and system in a law firm, is you start bringing in people who care about the same things and who want to keep evaluating the same things. So it's evaluating anything from, you know, how we ask and frame our interview questions, all the way to how we look at our, you know, promotion and compensation structures and what we're rewarding for that. Can we do more to reward community involvement and things that maybe aren't traditionally billable? So it's kind of cool to be here at this time because I get to be involved in summer conversations. So I'm getting more involved as we go.
Thank you. I'm gonna ask the panel probably one more question, moderated question or two, but I definitely want, if people have questions for the panel or for me, please feel free to use the chat and we'll monitor those and get those in. So just wanted to invite folks to join the conversation that way. The thing that struck me is just how similar. So we talked about titling this event and talking about, thinking about legal organizations, and there's a lot of ways that nonprofit organizations and law firms are very different, right? But when we thought of, when I heard you all talking, when you say, the structure at your firms is what attracted you to your firm, it's very similar to the lesson I learned, as I said in my presentation about what is the internal structure that we have that is ongoing, that's consistent, that is saying we are committed to addressing these issues that are certainly part of the national discourse. So that was really heartening for me to hear. And the other thing is just, Tom, to your point, I think that I just really want to amplify what you said about when you gave that example about whether the pro bono case, someone said we didn't take you did an exploration about why a pro bono case wasn't taken, and you just asked the question why, and then when you asked that question, basically it was real, it came out that it was, we actually that you could actually move forward with taking that case, and I think that goes back to what I said before about discretion. And all of you are relatively, as I understand, new in your careers too. And I just really want to appreciate and applaud you for being so active in your in your firms, and really leaning into the discretion you have. It's very easy to be brand new in a job and brand new in your career in thinking through where you want to be, in the next 5-10 years of your career, and say like, I'm just here to do the work, and like these things may distract from that, or that may be a risk that may create some challenges for me to accede in this still very kind of like a structured way in order to succeed in the law firm, in law firms. So I just really want to commend you all for in your own ways thinking through how you can use your discretion to actually create the workplace that you want, create the workplace that's in line with your values. And it sounds like all of you are also invested in making sure that the employees that come after you are a beneficiary of a better and stronger workplace. I just really want to appreciate that and say thank you to that for doing that. I think, it's really important to acknowledge that June 2020, over a year ago now, is certainly going to be a time in history that we will all, everybody in this meeting will be reflecting about what we learned then, what we did then, and how we felt about the change that seemed palpable for many folks then, and how we have thought about that since then. And one of the things that was robust about that time period was that we had organizations across, in various sectors, in the private, public, politicians, corporations, talking about what their commitments were going to be because of this moment of change, right? And there has been all sorts in this last year, in the last couple of months particularly, there have been all sorts of reckonings about what actually happened. People issued these press releases, said all these wonderful things about how they were going to give money and time and resources to actually making racial justice a priority for their organizations. And then, the accounting that's being done, and most recently the Washington Post did one that was really interesting about the investments that were made by banking institutions. About 90%, so when they did an accounting of the state of the large banking institutions that said that they were going to be making commitments to communities of color, in the tune of billions of dollars, about 90% of those went to tools and strategies that actually resulted in money coming back to the bank. So, and overwhelmingly there were mortgages. So it's really interesting to be living during this time and watching this accounting being done in real time and thinking through, are we going to have a change? And Luke and Alycia and Tom and Mike and I were talking before this call about the article in the New York Times yesterday that talked about how defund police was certainly a theme that was talked about from many different sides, controversially from many sides last summer. And the New York Times just recently reported that most police budgets that weren't actually defunded. And in fact, a year later, a lot of them are getting more funding. And that's primarily a narrative change. So there's a lot of things to unpack and explore and thinking about that. And certainly all of us as attorneys and attorneys invested in racial justice are thinking about that. And the question I have for Luke and Alycia and Tom is to go expansive and think about the legal profession. What do you think the responsibility of the legal profession, of lawyers, of judges, of all the people who do all the creative things with law degrees in this moment of time, like what is our obligation to kind of keep the momentum that certainly got to a high point last summer, to keep that and sustain that, particularly in our profession? Who wants to take this lofty question first?
I can start. I think in order for the legal profession to ensure sustained just investment in equity, we in the profession just need to do just that, right? Sustain the investment. We live in a time where people are very for the moment, trying to figure out the best way to trend or to not get canceled or to look good, like from a business perspective, from a PR perspective. But that type of dynamic, I don't think can sustain long-lasting change, right? We need people who are passionate about equity, who are focused on diversity of all types, and who are just committed to inclusion. I don't think we need purely performative acts. We need people to move in the world and actually address the systemic problems that are plaguing the legal industry. You know, we have lack of access, we have lack of resources, we have a lack of diversity as a whole, and that can mean various things. These are issues that we as people of color specifically face in the legal industry that are so pervasive, and yet there's still so many people out there who are willing to just turn a blind eye to it. And I think that has to end, and we need to do the work to make that end.
I'll add a little bit to that. I mean, I 100% agree with Alycia, and I think it's also just going to take a couple of things. The bigger thing I think it'll take is kind of just the decisions, you know, especially among law firms, you know, they're businesses, they have to make, you know, businesses at the end of the day. But, you know, there are some that you can choose. You say, okay, did we make a decision that is actually, you know, better for what we think is better for the community, or the one that's going to make us more money? And it's going to take a real shift to kind of push more towards the former. No, we're going to do this because it's the right thing to do, you know, regardless of the business decision, the business aspect of it. And those are hard calls to make, and it's kind of hard to pick any one example. Go for it. But I think it's that kind of mentality that's going to start to need to be taking over. And the way we get there, I think, is just like Alycia was saying, it's voices in the room, like who's making these decisions, you know, kind of tying all these together, having people who were a part of those decisions, who get to vote on those decisions from either diverse backgrounds or people who just care about, you know, society generally, care about these issues. Having them in the room is really important. And I think lawyers nowadays, you know, we evaluate situations, we know the pros and the cons, we know the benefits of going, you know, with the more just decision versus the one going with the more economical or conservative or safe decision. And it's really going to take, I think, all of us pushing each other to kind of be more courageous and take the more just route when it comes down to it.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And for me, the biggest change is it has to transform, you know, DEI efforts have to transform from a task or a goal to your identity, right? You're not doing these things because they're hot button issues, or because clients are demanding more diverse pitches, or because, you know, you can monetize, you know, certain things by associating with the, you know, revolution of the day, so to speak, right? It has to become part of your identity, to the point that your name, whatever your name is, so Keker, Van Nest, and Peters, that name needs to be synonymous with diversity, equity, inclusion, and it needs to be felt and heard and seen throughout the firm. One way, as Alycia and Tom talk about, is who's in the room, right? What is your partner makeup? What is your associate makeup? What is your staff makeup? Okay, that's not to say that everybody that looks a certain way is a certain way, you know, but it's one way to say this is something we value, right? And another way is where's your money going, right? Where are your donations going? What are you prioritizing? What are you investing in? And then third, we talk a lot about pro bono, but, you know, pro bono connotes so much, right? And it's separate from work. Pro bono isn't just work. It's not just a case, it's a pro bono case, right? So how about let's take more cases that aren't pro bono that meet these ends that have become a part of our identity, so that, you know, we're not just relegating the good work to the pro bono side of things, where people like, you know, Alycia, Tom, and I do when we have time, right? Like, it should be a part of everybody's practice. It should be a part of the firm's, you know, culture and ethos. And that's gonna take a lot of looking in the mirror from people at the top of these institutions. You know, look around. We're all in various rooms, and every single room has to look a certain way, right? Not just the ones in the racial justice committees, or in the pro bono committees, or in the D.E.I committees. No, the management committee's got to look a certain way. The management has to look a certain way and has to be a certain way. And for us, I think for the younger generation, this is the last thing I'll say, we have to keep the pressure on, because it's not going to change if we don't put pressure and keep pressure and advocate and use our resources and our voices and, frankly, our talents, right? We are young lawyers coming up. We've been trained well at Berkeley and at EBCLC, you know, and places want us to work there. So we want to work for places where we're going to be seen, but also the vision that we have for what an equitable legal institution looks like is also something that's met not only with, you know, agreement, but also action.
Thank you. All of that is profound, and all of that is, I hope, things that we're all taking to heart. You know, the goal of this panel is certainly for everyone in this who attended, is to be able to take some token of something, some morsel of what we're saying here, to take back to your organization. And I think each of you have relayed that. I think also just want to say that the question of who's in the room is always an important one, I think, as a lawyer. I started this, my remarks by talking about how FIHA, the California's anti-discrimination law, was passed in 1959. I think it might be important to think about who was in the room when that law was written, and who wasn't in the room. And what I can tell you is that the first Black person elected to California Senate was in 1967, almost 10 years after FIHA was written. The first Black woman was elected in 1978. So again, thinking about when that law, anti-discrimination law, was put in place in 1959, who was in the room and who wrote that law, and thinking about that in a respectful way, again, because it certainly was important at that time. And certainly it's important to acknowledge that, you know, the 1959 California law was before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the federal law. But also thinking about how much has changed since 1959 about who's in the room. Also very fair to say what hasn't changed when we think about that. And as lawyers, as people who are implementing and enforcing laws, I always think it's important to look at the data when this law was passed, and think about who was in the room when that law was passed, and then incorporate that into how you were applying that law, how you were arguing about that law, how you were arguing against that law, because our country has certainly changed a lot since many of the laws and policies were created. So we have one question in the chat. Thank you, Luke. Luke's question is about surveys. Wanted to know, and I certainly, you know, I have experience with EBCLC, but I wanted to know from Alycia, Tom, and Luke, if your organizations, if your firms do surveys at all, if you have any responses to Luke's question, and also want to invite other attendees, if they have any questions for any of the panelists, to put those in the chat as well.
We do a lot of surveys at Keker, actually, and we just kind of went through a round, kind of a 4-year later major cultural survey. You know, how have we progressed over the past 4 years? And a big report was created, et cetera. And we're in the process of creating supplemental surveys off of that. And they've been very helpful, because I think that, you know, one of the things we always joked about being at Berkeley is very much a bubble, right? And it's easy to get comfortable in your opinions and thoughts, because people are, you know, usually going to agree with you or what you're doing. And the same is true institution, right? There are bubbles in an institution where you could think that something is just a fact that everybody knows, but another bubble would have no idea. And I think with the structure, the hierarchical structure of law firms, that's even more true. So a lot of these surveys have been aimed at, what is the culture for X group, whether it's associates, whether it's a person of color, whether it's a woman, whether we're talking about ability lines, what it may be. And the results of those surveys catch a lot of people off guard sometimes, but that's how information is passed along in an anonymous way that, then the proof is in the pudding. We have this on paper, that there are things that need to be worked on and things that need to be addressed, or this group is feeling that way. So they've been very effective for us, and we will definitely continue to employ them moving forward.
Yeah, same at Frankfurt Kurnit. We also have a lot of surveys that go around about various things. This week specifically, we've had a lot of surveys around like gauging pro bono interest in different types of activities that we're planning just for the firm, like in our LA office and in our New York office. So we like to say, if you pick this date, you said you were free, it's 2 months out, you can no longer say like, oh, you didn't hear about this or you don't know. So I like that dynamic of it. And then we also have, I believe it's bi-weekly, sometimes monthly, depending on the time of year, but we have associate council meetings that are specifically geared towards just like us being able to express how we're feeling about firm structure, firm policy, what's going on in the world and how the firm is reacting to that. Like someone mentioned earlier, the types of events that the firm sponsors is very important. So during these meetings and during the surveys that go out in relation to these meetings, we also discuss like, okay, well, we're talking all this good talk, but where's the money going? So we have a lot of various ways in which we can gauge like where people are in the industry, where people are at the firm specifically, and how the firm can just do better.
Yeah, I'm trying to think back. I don't think we're super survey heavy. I know we've done a handful over the last year or so that I've worked here. A lot of them are related more to sort of like how everyone's doing and holding up during the pandemic, work from home and all that kind of thing. But I think Alycia, we covered it really well. One thing that's that I like that we do that's uncomfortable for me, because I don't like talking about myself, is we kind of have a career development plan that we have every attorney and staff kind of set. So you have to basically set your goals, for the quarters every few months. Like they kind of make you check in and make you always accountable. And that goes to our practice director and to our managing partner. So there's kind of a lot of, again, structure and layers that kind of everyone's aware of, like, oh, Tom wants to do this by the time he's a second year. Okay, so is he pushing for that? Like, does he have opportunities to push for that? And I think that's also another way. It's not necessarily a survey. It's kind of an accountability tool that can kind of help people set their own goals with coaching, and then make sure that the organization is supporting them in trying to meet those goals.
Thank you. One thing I'll add is that, we've done surveys for all sorts of things. When we were early in the vaccine the COVID-19 vaccine being available, I definitely wanted to learn from staff in an anonymous way about who was getting vaccinated, what barriers they were experiencing to getting vaccinated, if any, what side effects they had, if they had any. And I wanted this information, certainly as the employer, but also to share with other staff, because if there people had questions about, if they're questioning whether to get the vaccine, had questions just about all sorts of things, I think this type of peer information was critical. And to the question, Luke, like asking race about and is important. In every survey that we ask our staff, we ask for race, we ask for gender identity, and because it's a very different thing to say 90 or, this is a fake statistic, I don't have our survey in front of us, but it's a very different thing to say 90% of our staff is vaccinated, and then to look at that data and actually say, oh, it's actually, all the white people are vaccinated in our organization and none of the folks of color are, right? That gives you a very different analysis, and it gives you a very different, approach to how you're thinking about what conversations need to be had, or what information people need in order to think about what kind of medical care they should be getting in light of the pandemic. So I would say, whenever you do a survey, certainly I think anonymous surveys are important, but leaning into asking about race and thinking through how that plays out in your data. If folks know me, know that I am very much a believer that race neutrality is a fiction. There is no system or organization in this country, in this world, in which race neutrality is not synonymous with white supremacy. So to continue to act like to do, whether it's in our analysis, whether it's in our employment structures, to essentially not ask race is a way to just ignore racial disparities that are occurring. And so it's really incumbent upon us as attorneys, as professionals, to get comfortable talking about race and to not be afraid, as I talked about earlier, is not to be afraid of our data on race. Because as long as we ignore race, then those issues that we want to address, those, when we had that reckoning last summer about we need to be thinking about how we are showing up as a company, as an organization in this moment of racial reckoning. If we're not comfortable talking about race, if we're not even willing to collect the data about race and reckon with it, then we are nowhere near to creating the systemic changes that we need across this country and certainly in our profession. I want to again do a promotion for comments. I wanted to, and I also wanted to ask, if there's a moderator's privilege to ask Luke and Alycia and Tom something. I wanted to speak a little bit to law students, people who are getting ready to enter the legal profession. Do you consider being a part of your firm's DE&I efforts risky? Because you are certainly publicizing or making your values and your views known in your workplace in a very public way, and you could opt not to do that, and you're certainly creating a reputation for yourself. And I ask this question to specifically think about it for our law students and folks who are just beginning to, who will be entering a new legal or new employment relationship in the next year. I ask that as we think about, as they think about what they may want, if maybe they're going to a firm that has a great reputation for and has internal structures, and maybe they're going to one that does not. And so I would ask you to speak to them. And my question to you, which is, do you consider your work, your internal work on DE&I risky?
I do not see it as risky, but I also acknowledge my privilege that I carry, as a man, as a light-skinned man, as someone with a very German sounding name. For me, I don't think it's risky, but it's also, to the extent that it is, it's a risk that I'm willing to take. And if I can't do this at a place that I work, then I don't want to work there. So I'll be the one making the decision to leave or making a decision based on any perceived risk. I also think that it's a necessity because if I'm not willing to do it, then, someone may be less bold or with other, measures that may render it risky are way less likely to do the work. So to me, I think it's important to find a place that you're considering working at and ask that question, what is the makeup, do young associates or young lawyers participate in DEI efforts or any sort of efforts at the firm? Like, what's your voice look like? And if people say, mainly you have to wait till you're a senior associate or you've worked for 5 years before people take you seriously, then think about that when you make that decision. But for me, I don't think it's risky. I think it's necessary. And I feel not supported by everybody in what I do, but I feel like there are enough people that support me and are with me and collectively, we have a good mechanism for change.
For me, it's been pretty risky. I think it's pretty risky. I'm very grateful that at my current firm, I have a lot of support for all the DEI initiatives, and also the firm itself is very DEI oriented. So I feel like even some of the things that I'm involved in weren't my idea, but I was able to tag on to them. And I was like, this is a good environment for me personally. But in my career, I've definitely been told to tone down my resume, to not put any racial justice things on there, to not, speak out about racial issues, to not even express like myself. Like a lot of things that I talk about stem from like my upbringing and being like Jamaican American first generation. I've been told not to talk about that. I've been told not to wear my hair a certain way, not to dress a certain way, run the gamut, right? And people have told me like to my face that it can be very off-putting. It can affect business development, things like that. But I also think like Luke, it's worth it, right? If I'm not going to do it, who's to say that anyone else is going to do it? And I also really don't want to work in a place where that's looked down upon, right? I shouldn't have to argue with you about human rights. I shouldn't have to argue with you about basic, human decency, and that you should treat people a certain way. People should have access to certain resources. People should be able to live their lives in a very in a normal way, right? And I feel like, yes, it's risky in that you can get a lot of pushback, but I also think the risk is worth all the rewards that, we're trying to work towards.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think I don't think it's risk necessarily in terms of risking your career like as a whole, right? Because if some place you're looking at doesn't respect, your commitment to diversity or your values about diversity, there's somewhere else that does it that's going to hire you. So I don't think it's necessarily going to hold you back in your career. I think it's more about how difficult it's going to be for you to thrive and do things you want to do. I think it's probably the bigger risk because some places might resist it. Some places might kind of just actually in the reverse kind of expect the person of color to do the diversity work at the firm, and that's just kind of like, oh, of course you're going to do that because obviously, right? So I think there's kind of more of that weight that's on your shoulders, and I think that's the bigger risk is you risk taking on that role and you risk have to take on those fights all the time, which is just emotionally draining and exhausting. But to what Luke and Alycia just said, it's worth it. And honestly, if someone doesn't, then that organization just will stay in neutral the entire time. So I personally I feel very supported in anything that I want to do. There's lots of mentors and champions I can go to if there's something I really want to try, and they'll help me figure it out here at this firm. I know that's fortunate. I'm also a white passing male. I can pretty much go into any room and speak the language, and no one's going to question me at the outset. But I think I think it's important to kind of keep going with it. So I don't think there's a lot of consequence, and I think really you can only gain for it. I told some friends in law school the same thing when they were like concerned about too much public interest on their resumes. I'm like, no, like highlight that because those are important experiences. They bring value to organizations because it's perspective that they might not have or they might need more of.
Thank you. We got a couple questions in the chat. I'm wondering if I can combine two. Bear with me. I think I'll get there. So one, just want to acknowledge that Tom and Luke and Alycia all come from different size firms, and they can talk a little bit about theirs, and they have mentioned that before. So this question is about a small firm and how to do surveys without to make it truly anonymous. I think the question I'm really interested in too is thinking about tokenizing. I think whether you're at a small organization or a large organization, tokenizing can occur, and particularly organizations that are not as far along in their recruitment. And tokenizing, and Milo, I see your question too, tokenizing certainly occurs with folks who are in the transgender non-conforming community as well. And I think that there's a lot loaded in that. When we want to celebrate diversity at organizations and we want to do that, for example, by encouraging people to have Black History Month celebrations or encouraging those staff members to maybe host those types of events and things like that. It's a very fine line of tokenizing. And I think that tied to that is this question about how you retain people. Because it's one thing to say, hey, look, we have a leadership that has, we are a Black-led organization, or we did this pro bono case for a trans woman of color, incarcerated trans woman of color. It's another thing for someone to get into your organization and actually find that it is not an organization that is actually very receptive and welcoming to people who look like you and have your lived experience. So I'm wondering if you all can speak to both of these questions about how do you build a culture of retaining people from various lived experiences and backgrounds, and incorporate into your D&I culture a mechanism that is not tokenizing to the folks who are the generally a smaller group. I imagine all of us are still, generally a smaller group of people who have from historically excluded communities. Does that question make sense? Do you all see how I'm trying to get at this question? Good, I see some nodding, so maybe you all have what you need.
I'll try and take it first stab, and then I'm going to rely a lot on Alycia to help me out after I ramble. So I think, so Hanson, it's a mid-sized firm. I think it's about a little bit less than 200 attorneys and somewhere in the ballpark, 300 to 500 people, like employees total. Sorry, I froze. Can you hear me okay still? Oh.
We can hear you, Tom. Alycia, do you want to start while we're waiting for Tom to get Are you?
Yeah, are you back?
Alycia,
If
you
not, I
start
can-
and then time will come back in.
Yeah, for sure. So I think in relation to your question about retention and just like not being tokenized, I think it's important to ask people where they are and meet them where they are. I think so much of firm structure and like the issues that we face in firms comes from like actual lack of communication, right? So we talk about surveys and we talk about the results of those and how they're disseminated, but we don't talk about actually like getting to know people and getting to know their motivations and why they even want to work at an organization, right? I think the idea of like being disillusioned when you come into a firm, that can be addressed just by a conversation. And I think people are honestly very genuinely like open to having conversations of here's what I expected, here's like what the reality is and how can we adjust from that point forward. And I think it's important to acknowledge that like oftentimes in situations like this, there can be retaliation. So if you know that's a likelihood in your organization for whatever reason, even like from, you know, the managing partner down, I think that's something to be acknowledged as well. And that's something to be worked on. If I say to you that I'm concerned with, you know, the fact that the firm talks a lot about diversity initiatives, but doesn't do anything. And then from that point forward, we still don't do anything. And I'm getting, you know, less work and I'm not being invited to things and stuff like that, then that's an issue. But if I'm saying to you that, hey, I think this is a problem, how do we fix it? Here are my ideas, what are yours? And then we actually implement steps in that direction, then I feel like that would help with retention and also make me feel like I'm not just this sole person that you go to just to talk a good game and not do any actually like action items.
I think I'm back now. Sorry about that, y'all. Yeah, so snaps to Lisa, 100%. I think the point I was going to finish making is in terms of just like the structural part when it's like the size of an organization thing. You know, these issues can be broken up into topics, right? You don't have to necessarily tackle the big question all at once. So to the extent you're able to organize maybe a talk or, you know, like a luncheon or some kind of educational events around maybe you know, issues of transgender representation in DEI initiatives, for example. Maybe that's something you can kind of create the space to talk about it and invite other people to come and learn and come and share ideas or share questions where it's kind of that's topic of the day. So no one person's necessarily tokenized. It's just, you know, everyone's there to kind of try and get through the same situation. So I think that's kind of one effort. And it's hard because it's so personal in terms of, you know, do you feel like you're being tokenized? Do you feel like you're the person of color or the trans person or the LGBT person in the room who has to talk about those issues? So it's really hard to pinpoint, but I also think that by trying to ask the questions or trying to, you know, care about those issues or collect data or design educational programs, I would hope that I would hope that it goes in a way that at least shows the organization cares about that and is trying to do better. So it's, if you're a manager trying to do it, I think there's a fine line to toe and you want to be careful and sensitive and aware, but you also should take the step and show that you care about that and that you value those opinions and those people in your organization.
I agree with all of that as well. And one thing that Alycia said was communication. A thing that always baffles me is when, you know, diverse people leave a place. In my opinion, nobody should be confused or taken aback, right? That just means that you have no idea what this person wants with their life, right? The question should be, what do you want and where do you want to go? And how can we as an institution get you there, right? What can we do to get you there, right? Certain people are just going to say, you know what, I just don't want to do this type of work, okay? And then it's not really a retention issue. It's just, okay, a career change issue, right? But if you want to do the similar work, or you could have wanted to do that work, but for reasons over the past few years, you either burnt out, didn't feel valued, didn't feel heard, then it's a retention issue. So communication goes a long way there. And another thing I'll say, and this is more of a macro issue and just me being whimsical, but a lot of retention issues in the law firm context relate to partnership, right? And so if we're struggling getting diverse associates to become partners, then maybe we should think about what a partner is, right? And maybe we should think about if there's different types of partners we can have or different lifestyles that can be displayed that partners have to make that something that is attractive, right? What are your worries about being a partner? Why would you not want to be a partner? Okay, let's work on that. You know, let's do these different things. So you want to have a practice that focuses, you know, predominantly on X. All right, let's carve that out. Let's do that, right? The firms have to be willing to mold themselves to the interests, desires, and talents of the people they are seeking to retain, right? You can't just keep hoping that people want to stay at a place that doesn't move, especially when the people you want to retain are usually people with lots of different interests, lots of different opportunities, and lots of ambitions, right? You have to make those ambitions coincide with the firm's ambitions so that there is a place that that person can see themselves staying.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that that's the perfect way for us. Unless there is any final questions, I would love to just to sit with that. Particularly just like, how are we willing to create a culture? Like DE&I is more than a committee, and it's more than doing like celebrations on certain holidays. I think that's a big lesson of Juneteenth. There's like a lot of organizations made that a holiday, quote unquote, but then didn't do the work to make their workplaces actually safe places for Black folks, and didn't do the work to think about how potentially they were upholding police misconduct in their work, right? And that's why we're still in the place we are now. So I would invite everyone to be thinking about what their role is in the workplace culture, the way that Alycia, Tom, and Luke are so bravely doing. And again, just a reminder of just like they are, I really appreciate all of you being honest about how you see your risk in this, and why it's so important to you, despite some of the things that may be risky for you. So thank you all for spending your time with us this afternoon. We hope you learned some concrete measures that you can take with you. I did want to just say that if you want to stay connected to EBCLC, there's some key ways to do that. One, you can sign up for our mailing list. If you are new to EBCLC, you can email us at info@ebclc.org. If you are an alumni, you can email us at alums@ebclc.org. Certainly follow us on social media, leave comments when we get it wrong, and we'll do our best to get it right. We do all sorts of things in EBC in our social media, including talking about how we celebrate our diverse staff, including talking about how we relate to how we as an organization relate to national issues. We also do live updates and get staff to answer questions. So it's a fun time over there. And certainly donate and encourage your organization to donate to EBCLC. We are a 501c3. I think it was Luke who raised it earlier about where does your organization and donate to and invest in. I think most law firms do donate, and that was something that came out again in June 2020, where people were thinking where law firms were donating. And certainly pro bono hours are an important resource, but cash is also really critical during this time. So I invite you all to consider making a personal donation to EBCLC, particularly if you like this program, like to see more of them. Consider using your discretion and talking to folks in power about making a donation to EBCLC or other mission-aligned organization. And then also thinking about if your organization has a matching program or actual foundation, whether that foundation can make a donation to EBCLC or make an investment in EBCLC. So thank you all again so much for joining us. I'm really grateful again to Michael and Luke, Alycia, and Tom especially, and I appreciate all the ways that you're making our legal profession better. And thank you to everyone on this call, and we will be following up with you with your MCLE certificates. Thanks, everyone.